session is about to start now. Please take your seat. The session is about to start now.
So what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's very, very interesting discussion around metrics that matter. My name is Abdul Matheen. I am the CEO of Project U, the SDG for Youth and Student Network member from UNESCO, as well as a Global Youth Ambassador with Their World. And it's my honor and pleasure to host today's discussion on day 9 of COP28 at the rewirEd Summit on this very, very critical issue. Very honored today to be joined by a very distinguished and accomplished panel. And I'm sure we're going to have a very, very informative discussion over the next 40 minutes or so. Thank you so much. So before we get started, just as a means of introduction towards the wonderful panel that we have Director Martin from the UNESCO IIEP. He is the director of the UNESCO International Institute for Education Planning. And before that, he served as the Minister of Education in Peru, Superintendent of Higher Education, and Director of the Peruvian think tank Group for the Analysis of Development. Dr. Martin also holds a master's degree in education theory and policy, as well as a PhD in sociology from the Pennsylvania State University. He's also been a visiting scholar at the Stanford University Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences and at the Center Population at Development Université de Paris. Dr. Martin has numerous academic publications to his credit, particularly in the areas of education and child development. Following that, we have Dr. Randa, who is currently the CEO of education.org. She's motivated by training in medicine and neuroscience, and she moved into global education to contribute to reducing the gap between knowledge and practice, and has worked very closely with ministers of education and other education leaders. She's the former board member with the Global Partnership for Education and the former chair of its Strategy and Impact Committee, and her prior roles include being the CEO of the Lego Foundation, Global Head of Education Porticus, High-Level Working Group for the OECD Education 2030, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, Management Consultant at McKinsey, and she holds an MD and PhD in Neuroscience from Johns Hopkins University in the USA. So welcome, Dr. Randa. We have David Hollow, who serves as a director of Jigsaw Education, an education research organization and social enterprise based in London. He's committed to helping organizations use rigorous evidence to bring about lasting change in education. He has worked in over 25 countries with a variety of donors, governments, NGOs, and community-based organizations. David has worked in the international education and humanitarian sector for more than 15 years and has a PhD from the University of London. His doctoral research focused on evaluating the impact of technology on education in sub-Saharan Africa. David is a research director at the EdTech Hub and a board member for Refugee Education UK and Justice Defenders. We also have Kamran Robert Kardan, founder and CEO of Knowledge E, which is headquartered in Dubai. He founded Knowledge E in 2012 with the aim of providing unique, professional, and high-quality education services to information professionals in the Middle East. He also heads Knowledge E networking services, also based in Dubai, as well as the Knowledge E Foundation and Knowledge E UK, both based in the UK. Kamran has more than 20 years of experience working in the publishing industry on both the publisher and agency fronts, and he's worked closely with some of the top consortia, libraries, ministries, hospitals, and corporations within research and education in the region. He has experienced the birth and growth of many digital libraries, driven by his interest in learning societies. He has initiated and participated in the completion of various special development projects. Kamran holds a BSc in engineering and an MSc in marketing with a thesis on open access publishing business models, as well as an MBA from the University of Manchester with a dissertation on the application of business model canvas in university research offices. Kamran has an interest in community development and plays an active role in the Knowledge E Foundation, a community interest corporation focusing on supporting education and research-based projects across the globe. And finally, we have Sallyann, who serves as the CEO of GLEAC, a UAE startup and an industry expert. platform that exposes learners to deep expertise of more than 500 plus of the best experts, coaches, and mentors. GLEAC exposes learners to contrarian outlying thinking and deep context thinking through that is different from ChatGPT, through live sessions with experts, Mentor GPT, and micro practices focusing on soft skills. She was the former head of people and culture of Kareem, the first unicorn in the region. She is one of 4% of women globally as a sole investor on a patent on measuring soft skills and training agents in these skills, including AI. One of GLEAC's focus into 2024 is on green and new AI-enabled skills across all workforces and in education systems through an intergenerational approach, ensuring Gen X era are also not left behind. Sallyann is also the founder of Growing Leaders Foundation, employing youth for the last decade in soft and workplace skills across the Caribbean. So to get us started, I would like to invite Professor Matheen to join us for a presentation around UNESCO's view on this important topic.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Good morning. My name is Matheen Benavides. I'm going to go directly to the main point of my presentation, is to argue in favor of what we call the crisis and climate-sensitive educational planning. At the institute where I work, our mandate is to help countries to improve the way they do planning, they do management, and we have been developing different tools for including crisis and climate sensitive in this procedure of educational planning. So we help countries in the different moments of the policy formulations, program design, operational plan and cost and financing, monitoring and evaluation, and risk analysis. And the way we help countries is by trying to include in these different moments of the educational policy cycle internal and external data related to climate change. So for example, internal data collected by school census, we're also trying to incorporate new data. I'm going to show you an example of that on the EMIS systems of the countries and trying to give the idea that besides following curriculum, learning, also we have to be able to follow crisis and climate change data in order to develop some measures related to the impact of that. But also we are trying to incorporate what we call external non-educational data that will help us to analyze risks of natural hazards, including climate-induced hazards and conflicts. So in terms of the, within the internal data, internal educational data, we identify sources, data that we need for climate change adaptation. So we conduct school-level surveys to evaluate how, for example, teachers and learners understand and address climate change and environmental sustainability. We include specific questions and modules in annual census surveys, school inspections tools, and quality assurance frameworks. We use the results of such surveys to improve teachers and learners' knowledge and actions on climate change adaptation. So for us, when we address the needs from countries to mitigate climate change, we try them to incorporate this data in order to be able to respond using specific measures that we are going to be looking later also. But also, it's very important that the ministries of education use external data for having an important monitoring of the risk of climate change. For example, this is a graph where we analyze in a descriptive manner the relationship between flood exposure and gross enrollment rates in pre-primary education, and we can see that it looks like there is a negative correlation in the sense that countries that are more exposed to, or places that are more exposed to high exposure of floods are going to be more probably the countries where we're going to have less gross educational enrollment rates in pre-primary education. So this data is important for macro analysis of the negative impacts, but also, for example, in South Sudan, we developed a tool and analysis for building this relationship between the average monthly rainfall and the school calendars. No? And you can see in this graph that the peak of the flood and the yearly rainfall, the months where we have the more high exposure to that, are in the middle of the school calendars. So, I mean, what we can do with this information, no? And that's something that we are trying to discuss with countries. It's true that moving school calendars is not easy because there are social relationships related to that. There is communities around the systems, but this data is very, I mean, it's very clear. I mean, these months where we have the peak on the average monthly rainfalls are months where students are not going to be able to go to schools. So they're going to be learning less than other children in other contexts. So for us, this is very concrete. This is very clear. We have also been developing what we call land suitability analysis for identifying the places where it's recommended to build the schools, no, and places where it's not recommended to build the schools. So we have these maps. We have very much identified the different zones, and we also are trying to help countries to design schools in places where they are going to not going to have problems related to floods or natural hazards. And related to that, also we are trying to help countries to improve the way they do school inspections related to these issues. We also, I mean, this is also related to that. So our functions for helping countries to use climate data is related to technical cooperation and training. So we identify main climate change stressors in countries. We have been working in Liberia, South Sudan, Cambodia, Yemen, Jordan. We're analyzing the effects of hazards on education, the impact in terms of access, quality, management, and equity. We're analyzing the capacity to mitigate the effects of climate change. And also, we are helping countries to identify climate change adaptation and environmental sustainability measures. But also, we do training. We have been developing a global course on using data for crisis-sensitive planning related to this framework that I already talked about, and also a global course on fundamentals of crisis climate-sensitive planning. So we think that by this very concrete way to help countries, we will help Minister of Education to understand the effects of climate change and put in place adaptation and environmental sustainable measures. And for ending, we have been developing different adaptation measures and also environmental measures. For example, by developing contingency plans at the national, subnational, and school level, by helping countries to construct, rehabilitate, and equip more climate resilient schools, by evaluate feasibility of redesigning the academic calendar. This is something that we are already working very closely right now, by implementing distant learning programs, radio learning, and home learning package during emergencies, by creating contingency budget for disaster prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery, by strengthening the implementation of the homegrown school feeding program, and also by recruiting and training focal person within the Office of Coordination for Disaster Risk Reduction at a unit within the Ministry of Education. Also, there are other more other measures more related to curriculum, to knowledge. For example, review curriculum and develop a climate change and disaster risk reductions learning strategy, and also training teachers in disaster risk reduction and climate change issues. We as an institute, we are not related to implementing curriculum change, but we help countries to design and plan the way they can implement this curriculum as a response to the climate change problems we are facing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin, for that very, very interesting intervention. I think one of the critical factors when we're looking at education as a whole is how do we take into these, as you very rightly mentioned, external as well as internal factors that contribute towards the proper implementation and proper evaluation of educational programs. Dr. Randa, if I may pick your brain on this matter, how do we evaluate as folks who are teachers, who are school administrators, who are program administrators, within your experience over multiple different agencies, how do we factor in these external factors towards your educational metrics evaluation?
Purely for me, or did you want Martin first to respond? I thought you had a follow-up question for him.
I'd love for you to take the lead, and then probably Martin to add on to that as well.
So thank you for that, and thank you also, Martin, for that presentation. Very simple answer. I think a lot of the answers are known already, and they're locked in locally developed evidence that doesn't always see the light of day. I think when I speak a little later in this session, I'll try to make the link between metrics and resilient systems. And one of those mechanisms is listening to the front lines, creating the channels for locally generated evidence to rise to the surface, which will reflect all of the communities and situations you just mentioned. I don't think that's the only thing, but I think that is a critical lever to ensure that the knowledge we know is there is actually being visible and is useful.
Mm-hmm. Professor Martin, would you like to add on to that point as well?
Yes, I agree. From the side of our mandate, we call that micro planning. So we are also developing different measures to go more to the middle tiers, to the subnational level of governments, and help them to develop micro planning processes for dealing with this crisis and climate change issues. Yes.
And I think one of those interesting aspects is going to be how vulnerable people, as well as folks from refugee backgrounds, play a role. And with that, I'm really excited for our next intervention from David Harlow on this matter. Please, David.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a real great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the welcome. I'm David from Jigsaw Education, and I'm going to speak here about GLEAC, Global Evidence for Refugee Education. We all agree on the problem and the opportunity that we face. We need better ways of building evidence, and we need better evidence. This builds on what has already been shared about how we can make a fundamental shift in the way in which evidence is generated. We all know at the moment much research is extractive. Often local populations have tokenistic roles. There is limited feedback of findings. The problems are clear, and yet solving them is difficult. It requires hard work, and there are entrenched power dynamics. So what I've been asked to do is explore this with you and share for a few minutes a prototype that we have been working on with Global Evidence for Refugee Education for the last 4 years of how we can do this differently. Take seriously the question of whose evidence are we working with, whose metrics really matter. So the focus has been on refugee education and how we can build better approaches to evidence, addressing the evidence gaps in ways that are meaningful. So the prototype, a 4-year study, 3-year study over the last 4 years, working in Rwanda and Pakistan. The technical focus was building the evidence around post-primary education in those contexts. We worked with over 1,000 young people with a cohort of 31 young refugee researchers. The study was one of those amazing and rare times in life where things go better than you think they're going to go. But I'm not actually going to talk to you about the findings today. I'm going to talk to you about the how, about the model, the mechanism that we developed that can be a useful contribution for how we shift the way research actually happens. We had fantastic catalytic funding from Dubai Cares and a wonderful group of partners to conduct the work with. So, 31 young people, young refugees in Pakistan and Rwanda, either enrolled in higher education or recently graduated, working for 3 years on the study, paid throughout, getting an accredited qualification, and crucially, engaged in the research at every single stage. We need to move away from extractive research where we have tokenistic participation. And that means we need to think about every stage of a project, from design through to data collection, through to analysis, through to co-publication, meaningful participation at all levels. There's a whole range of outputs that are all available online, all of them co-authored together. So, what comes now? We've built a prototype, it worked, and we now are launching GEAR, Global Evidence for Refugee Education. It's an applied research initiative with young refugees at the centre so that we can build better evidence, raise awareness, and ultimately improve decision-making for refugee and climate education, and crucially, the intersection between them. There are 4 interconnected problems that we're seeking to address that will be familiar to many of you and at the core of much of your work as well. We know there are evidence gaps in refugee and climate educations that need to be addressed, but we know that refugee young people are marginalised from the process of that evidence building. At the same time, refugee young people lack access to professional development and reliable pathways into employment. So by addressing these evidence gaps in ways that give meaningful roles for the affected population and accredited training at the same time, we can build better pathways into employment, and we've started to see that happen already. So we had this practical model. We now want to scale that with GEAR so that we can build a global network of refugee researchers who can shape the future of their own evidence building agenda. We want to make a fundamental change in evidence building to shape the future of the sector so that we can have better refugee and climate education research that is built in better ways. 2 of my wonderful colleagues, Asma and Noor, I would have loved if they could have been here as well. They went through this whole program and they are now my colleagues, team members, and they articulate that for Asma, the way in which GEAR provides the opportunity for refugees to learn and also contribute on a global stage. And for Asma, for Noor, the fundamental point that research is better when refugees are at the heart of the process. So I hope that's given you a little snapshot into GEAR, a prototype that we want to now scale that demonstrates how we can really shift the power and make a fundamental difference in the way evidence is built in refugee education and in climate education to shape a better future where evidence is driven by the affected populations and can then make bigger change in how decisions are made across the sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Very, very insightful presentation. If I could ask you, where do you feel are the next steps for this initiative? Where do you see the partnerships that need to come in play, and where do you see the next investment in time, energy, and resources for the next phase of chair?
Sure. I think two things. We need to build on the foundation that we have in Pakistan and Rwanda, working with incredibly talented groups of refugee researchers who can drive this agenda. And we need new partnerships to take that beyond. There are a range of high priority technical evidence gaps, issues where we don't know what the best next steps are in refugee education, in climate education, and how we build that evidence. So we need targeted research agendas where we can train cohorts of affected populations in a long committed process, so that when we gather in 5 years' time, we can say, actually, there's a shift in the way research is being built. We have done this differently. We are no longer doing extractive, tokenistic research, and the power has shifted. That's what we hope, and would love to talk to any of you about that.
That sounds very, very interesting. And one of the things that was interesting in your presentation as well was how there were differences between the two demographics that you had talked about. And I'd like to ask Sallyann, if I may, on this topic of when you talk about localization of metrics, but that also goes a lot to do with soft skills and how that plays a big role. Both around soft skills as well as the emotional intelligence that's localized. You've done a lot of research in that space as well as measuring those metrics. I'd love to hear from you on how those metrics are evaluated and how they can play a role in whenever you look at localizing some of the research, like we just saw.
Sure. Yes, and thank you for recognizing our work in soft skills, particularly for Dubai Cares. So at a local level, soft skills, culturally, it's very different, the signaling of it for different cultures. So think about crucial conversations in the United States and crucial conversations in a much more conservative culture like India, and how we relate to each other, and how we say things, and how do we extract information. And some of them you have to walk around in circles for months. Someone like me scares people a lot in those cultures. So I love the approach of bottoms up versus top down, which happens a lot when you're trying to surface this type of information. And yes, a cultural sensitivity going into all of it plays an absolute crucial role, because that's, garbage information in is garbage out. And if you do not address that, you might end up with a lot of garbage in and garbage out. The one thing I would love to say to on this particular project, and just to kind of add, which I would love to see, is many of these projects, you just need, I'm a techie, you just need tech and platforms to surface what you're doing, so that most of the global agencies and those of us out there doing work, and we can actually have an eye on what's going on. So I think a lot of your scaling is just signaling and visibility that you talked about. And sometimes it's just really simple as being able to have platforms where we can all go and crowdsource ideas, who's working on what, who's doing what, and to be able to surface that. Would love to chat with you about that.
Absolutely.
Sorry for my little tangent, but I needed to. I'm a startup founder too. I got to look out for our startup founders.
And rightfully so, when you're looking at global frameworks and global metrics, which leads into our next intervention by Dr. Randa on this matter. So please.
Thank you. I'm going to use the podium as well. I do not have slides, but I will stand back here. And as another startup founder, let me just first briefly introduce education.org as a young foundation. We're in our 4th year. And our entire purpose is making existing evidence easier to access and use for education leaders, and working with those leaders and their teams to strengthen institutional capacity for evidence-informed decision-making. And so if you haven't heard of us yet, that's why we're quite young. And you can go to education.org, literally, and see more about our work. Thank you to the organizers for hosting this today, and Abdul also for your very careful preparation. Thank you so much for also making it interactive and a great dialogue. Thank you also to Dubai Cares for being one of our first catalytic supporters. I want to be open about my agenda here. I realized I should do this as we're sitting down. When I was approached to speak just a few minutes about this, I was very clear to say, we don't focus on metrics, we focus on the use of knowledge and learning. And I thought, what a great opportunity to discuss with us together, not me talking at you, the link between metrics and resilient education systems. Whether we talk about climate crisis or other crisis, resilient systems are something that our education world is profoundly lacking. And that makes me very angry. I come from a medical and a science background, and I moved to education when I was a young mother for reasons that we won't speak about here, but they have to do with understanding how a child's brain develops and seeing very little use of that in education systems and policy. And so to echo Jasmine Sharif's comments, her irritation and agitation, what irks me is that we deal every day with urgent issues, but we do not act urgently in our sector uniformly. And so the one area that I have really been seeing in recent years, especially during COVID-19, but not only, and especially having been on the board of GPE, was this discussion, this very welcome growing discussion about resilient systems, preparedness for crisis, more funding, more blah blah in plans, and yet it is so fluffy. It is so fluffy in education when we talk about what it takes to be a resilient system, and yet there is a science of resilience. There is something called resilience engineering that has been birthed in the aeronautics and aerospace field. Abdul comes from that world. We discovered serendipitously, where you can understand you've all been on a plane at least once, if not hundreds of times. There's a reason why the risk is so low. Every accident, every near miss that we never hear about is studied and interrogated, and there is an inbuilt infrastructure, not just for monitoring and collecting info on metrics, but for learning from that information and using that learning to anticipate and using that anticipation to prepare. And so that's why I was delighted to be able to probe this just a bit. So if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, let's just look at one example of how that pandemic offered a silver lining to the medical world. And I'll challenge us to see what is our silver lining from that pandemic. Until the pandemic, does anyone know what the average length of time was for developing a vaccine? Anybody have an idea? You'll have to help me with time. I realized I didn't look when I started. Exactly, it's 10 years. How long did it take to develop the COVID-19? 9 to 10 months, depending which manufacturer. 10 years, 10 months. And why did it happen? It happened, go ahead. Urgency is part of it, but it's because there has been in medicine and public health a very solid learning infrastructure. There is a process of vaccine development. There is a method of trial, first for safety, then efficacy, then regulatory issues. They could accelerate because of urgency, but it's also because every time a vaccine is developed, there is an incredible amount of learning that goes in the process. They didn't make it up, right? I know that it's a very different world for education, but the point is, that's just one example where COVID-19 provided a silver lining based on a culture of learning and continuous improvement in health. And as of today, 72% of the world has had at least one injection. Now, if we look at education, I would argue we don't yet see this silver lining. Have we really, and by the way, even in the health world, the learning from the pandemic hasn't stopped. Every week, every month you see in journals some reflection or some analysis or evidence about something that happened in the pandemic and implications for improving when we go forward. I have not seen the same density of that attention in our education space. So here's, in the last minute or two, what I would cover briefly is this link between metrics and resilient systems. Primarily, that has a lot to do with elevating locally generated evidence, in my opinion. The second, briefly, is what are the barriers? Why aren't we doing more of this in education? And finally, a handful of opportunities that we might look to, but I'm doing this more because I think every one of us in this room, regardless of our role, you're coming to this session for a reason. You may be a technical person on the monitoring side, you may be working on the delivery angle, but everyone in this room can help us together stop the BS talk about resilience. There really are things we can be doing, and we need to be putting them in place more quickly. So if we look at the link between metrics and resilience, and if I draw on things from the aerospace world, what I'm going to share is not technical. It's going to be very logical to you. But as I draw out these 5 steps, I'm going to ask you to reflect on how good do you think we are as a sector at doing these things. Okay, so we start with metrics. From metrics, we get to evidence. Okay, and I think a lot of organizations and countries are very good at collecting metrics. We have EMIS and other things. So metrics to evidence is step 1. Evidence to knowledge. You know, metrics alone are not knowledge. And some of you may have heard the expression, data doesn't speak for itself. We have to somehow get from metrics to knowledge. Again, in that area, I think there are organizations that are exemplary in doing that. But here's where we break down. And Martin, when you put the wheel up there, 1 to 5, I think what I'm speaking about now is the glue between the wheels, going from knowledge to learning. And that's not philosophical. I'm not being academic or philosophical here. There is a mechanism. We, as a sector, are not a great learning organization. We create tons of knowledge, and we have incredible information out there. But do we really learn from it and move on, improve? So knowledge to learning is the 3rd area. The 4th is then, and here's where resilience engineering comes in, going from learning to anticipation. Martin spoke a little bit about this with regards to, a lot about this, using external characteristics and features. But this goes far beyond climate. We can see from population shifts, from drought, from climate issues, what are the other knock-on effects of girls, of impoverished communities, possibly even of pregnancy. This, for example, was done looking at the Ebola example in parts of Africa. And when COVID hit, a number of countries put in policy measures to ensure that pregnant girls and young mothers had access to school. So this anticipation component is something that I believe is just starting to grow some legs, to use that expression, but is still incredibly embryonic. And finally, and the most important part, is going from anticipation and modeling to preparedness. Actually putting in place policy measures or practice triggers that will shift depending on what you've been anticipating. Give you a very small example from Ukraine. They had a blueprint for disaster response, but very quickly after the war, they put in place or released central decision-making power and devolved it into districts, not communities, but local governance structures, because they knew that they were much more adaptable and flexible and closer to the ground. And that has translated into a much quicker resumption of learning in that crisis than was seen before. So these are the 5 key steps, and I'm not the resilience expert academic. I'm just bringing some things from other sectors that have incredible amounts of tools with them that we could be drawing on much more significantly. So what stands in the way of those things? Now, in our work, and I'm going to wrap up here because I'd love to have more discussion, I think all of us in the room can rattle off a lot of reasons why these things don't happen. It's too easy to say that it's money. Of course, that can be part of it, but the work that we're talking about is also about using existing funding much better, right? Getting the most value out of what we've done already and putting that to good use with very precious resources. There are other barriers in the way, and I'm going to invite later that if people see some big ones we should be addressing together, they should be raised. But the common ones, we have tons of academic evidence, very rarely translated for use, very rarely presented in a way that policy leaders can grasp. We often have work, I don't know if you've seen this in your own experiences, we have a tremendous amount of so-called published work. But most evidence in our sector is not published. It's so-called gray literature. Program evaluations, foundation reports, agency briefs, government papers, lots of things like this. And we know from our work, governments tend to draw on that unpublished work much more because it's contextually relevant. And that's what I started to allude to earlier in this conversation. I'll wrap it up here because I think this is one key opportunity. One key opportunity is learning how to better work with this type of evidence that we're less familiar with appraising. Coming from a science background, I know at the beginning that sounds counterintuitive. If it's not published, why? Is it low quality? We've been creating an international working group, and if anyone's interested, let me know. The working group is composed of 30 groups around the world and growing that is in the process of developing guidance. How do we better appraise so-called unpublished literature, and even published. There are lots of published pieces out there that lack quality. So understanding how to better emphasize local experience and link it to the metric collection and monitoring that we've been talking about is one key mechanism. The whole purpose of doing that is again linked to resilience and stronger preparedness and decision making. So I've skipped over a few things in the interest of time, but I think I'll just wrap up here. We've put on the table that the discussion of resilience in education is remarkably fluffy right now. And I think we owe it to our children and next generations to beef this up and really provide excellent tools for self-assessment and tools for strengthening that can be used much more widely, and that we hold ourselves accountable to a journey of strengthening this resilience as much as we can. I've also put down the message about the importance of locally generated evidence. It doesn't mean that we know everything in our own backyard, but if we were to get the evidence from all the backyards in the world and bring that up to the surface, there's so much more that we could be doing more quickly if we were able to surmount this one particular challenge, in addition to other actions that we're taking. So thank you for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Randa, for that very, very timely intervention. Before I jump to Kamran, because I'm very interested in getting the private sector view on all of this, I know Sallyann has to leave, so I would rather ask you, where do you feel, and I think this is really pertinent, right? With the advent of AI and its mass adoption by more than 150 million users every week, from tools like ChatGPT to DALL-E to all these other new tools coming up about, how does that impact how things get measured and how metrics are formed?
I think I'm on now. As I heard you speaking, I actually said, I can build a GPT for that. All of this unpublished work and all of these things that are not being surfaced can be surfaced so easily now, and you can have dialogues with them and have conversations with them, and they are it's so simple now to crowdsource the collective wisdom of all the pockets that's happening and have an eye on it, and it happens fairly quickly. So I would say it's a great time for those of us who have kind of been doing deep work to be able to now kind of look up and access the collective wisdom. And it goes to, I humbly apologize, I have another panel I have to be on at 12:30 somewhere across from here, 15 minutes away. But what I would like to say is it goes to this whole level of AI-enabled skills we should all have. So it's no longer hard skills and just soft skills. My argument is there's this layer of AI-enabled skills, and as each of our groups are working on our different projects, we all have to ask that question. What is the AI layer in this? And the AI layer allows us to signal. It also allows us to amplify and be able to do that fairly quickly.
Okay, that sounds really interesting, because I think that defining what those AI-enabled skills is going to be, it's going to be interesting how educators go around defining that, bringing sure that regulators are up to speed and can keep up with the pace of OpenAI and Google and all these other guys who are investing a lot in the development of GPTs, as well as young people and their rapid adaptation of those projects. So without further ado, Kamran, I think you've worked more than 20 years within this sector, building solutions and deploying them. How do you want to bring this matter to the forefront of what were you doing?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks to the GLEAC for the moderation, the fellow panelists.
And my apologies, I'm running out on you.
Go for it, yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone,
afterwards.
please feel free to contact me and find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you.
So these days, there can't be a panel without a discussion on AI and ChatGPT. So it's interesting that it came up. But just to circle around the work that we do, there's two aspects that I want to hone on. One is on data, not on creating data, but on the accessibility of the data. The second part is on measurement. So when we talk about data, evidence-based decision-making, working on climate issues, a lot of the content that is available, scholarly literature, is behind paywalls and is not accessible and discoverable by many, many individuals, especially in developing areas. You need to be an elite institution who have proper funding to be able to afford access to these resources. Now, production of these resources is another story. So we have seen the open science movement around the world. We've worked closely with UNESCO in the past 2 years to create a regional forum for open science and open research in the MENA region. We held the second symposium last month in partnership with UNESCO at Khalifa University. And it's all about providing accessibility, supporting discoverability, and finding affordable ways to be able to access this literature. So this is one area that we've came up. We've created a world global platform called Zendi, which is providing affordable or free access to scientific literature in places where it matters. And most of the 500,000 users that are on the platform are coming from developing regions. Now, using the power of AI, we are also making this information more accessible. One point that I want to talk about is about transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary research and an approach to the world problems, climate issues in higher education and education. And I think the use of AI will also enable the cross-disciplinary approach by being able to have a quick understanding of different subjects and different matters to be able to collectively come up with solutions to global problems. You mentioned the vaccine example. It was a fascinating example. First of all, world publishers, they made their content and their scholarly literature available for free to educators, to healthcare professionals, to researchers, to labs. So this was also part of that process in order to find an easy solution. Plus, an issue like COVID or the climate issue, this is not an issue that can be tackled by a single disciplinary approach. You need close collaboration between stakeholders, educators, universities in order to find solutions to these problems. So this is something that I highly encourage. I don't know how much time is available, but if there's time, I will also talk about metrics. If there's
please do so. Yes.
So one final point is talking on the metrics and measurement is when we look at universities and higher education institutions, a lot of them have moved away from their raison d'etre or their purpose of being there because of the race for funding that is linked to various ranking agencies. Now, and usually these are based on the race for a reputation, big production and citation counts in order to measure this scientific output. And it's really taking universities away from their purpose, which is towards their local communities, the social aspect, and sometimes even contributing to a global platform. There's been movement around this. This is, again, a very big topic to discuss. We see even ranking agencies moving towards impact rankings, sustainable rankings, but that's not enough. I think from higher education institutions, they need to also really stick to their mission, their objectives, and what their metrics is not a purpose. Metrics is to help you move towards a certain goal. So I think it's having that sort of holistic approach, having that understanding, using metrics as a tool for reflection and not as a purpose. So that's something that we are also working closely towards. So we are supporting accessibility to literature. We're trying to support capacity building by providing skills in an online, self-paced way to support lifelong learners. And we're also helping developing regions in sharing their knowledge and dissemination of their information through various publishing platforms and even on platforms like Zendi. So this is how data and impact comes together.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, and for those very interesting points. It reminds me of a saying that the purpose of a car is not to put fuel in it, right? Fuel just helps get to a destination. The purpose of metrics is not just to evaluate stuff, but it's us to get to this human flourishing is a new term that's being used, and perhaps that is one of the outcomes of metrics. We're out of time for this very, very important and very, very insightful discussion that we've had over the last 45 minutes or so. As Sallyann said, please reach out to everyone on LinkedIn. Their names are right there on the screen, and everyone over here has points of collaboration that you can connect to them with, and I'm sure that would be very important. Does anyone like to say any closing words or comments?
Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
It's a nice, cozy room. So I hope we've had a nice, engaging conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be around. And